Welcome to the Fearless Project podcast. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman, and today I'm going to be reacting and breaking down more news coming out of the Oval Office. President Trump, 10 days into his second term, is making waves in the media for his most recent suggestion that Egypt and Jordan absorb the Palestinians from Gaza, bring them into their sovereign nation as refugees or as displaced peoples in order for Israel to complete its war aim of destroying Hamas in Gaza, which they can't do with the constraint of the dense civilian population. We know that Hamas has built its infrastructure around densely populated civilian areas. And so, in order for Israel to complete its war aim, President Trump is suggesting that they remove the civilians from Gaza in order for the war to continue with the least amount of civilian casualties. So, this is Trump's answer to the humanitarian crisis. And also, while it's unpopular, which we'll get into why, this is a different alternative to the conflict than we've seen. Now, the reason his suggestion is controversial is because it harkens, ideas of ethnic cleansing. The international community, the UN, Egypt and Jordan have both condemned this as being contrary to the two-state solution, in which both Egypt and Jordan have upheld as the only solution that they're interested in seeing happen. But it raises real questions. Is the two-state solution a viable solution? Is it tenable after this conflict and this war? Can a two-state solution happen if Hamas is still ruling Gaza? And I would argue that's not possible with Hamas's zero-sum aims. But we're going to break down the news, the coverage of it, the international outrage, what ethnic cleansing is, and what potential solutions to this conflict might be. I hope you enjoyed the episode. All right. So Trump is making waves 2 weeks into his second term, and the international community is outraged by his most recent proposal that Jordan and Egypt take in or step up and play a larger role in finding a solution to the conflict that's currently happening with Israel and Hamas in Gaza. So I'm reading from a J-Post article here that covered it. It says U.S. President Donald Trump called on Jordan and Egypt to accept more Palestinians from Gaza as the war-torn territory recovers from a 15-month-long deadly conflict with Israel. I have the audio that I will play shortly of President Trump speaking to that reporter on Air Force One. But what President Trump is noting is that, all right, this conflict has been largely dragged out. The war has been politicized. The last presidential administration conditioned aid to Israel, which largely hindered their ability to continue their offensive in Gaza. And so we need some sort of a solution moving forward that also minimizes the cost of civilian casualties. And this is his solution. Now, I think there's some logistical concerns. The fine line between civilian and combatant makes it a huge security threat to both Egypt and Jordan in absorbing that civilian population. But I think what President Trump is proposing is a different alternative or a different step towards some sort of a two-state solution or self-governance for the Palestinians that's different from the status quo. I think many people want the ceasefire to go through, which has also been quite fragile. Hamas has not delivered many of the hostages that Israel has asked for. So it's a fragile ceasefire, but many people want things to return to the status quo. They want to hand Hamas the keys back to Gaza, for Israel to completely withdraw, and for things to return to October 6th. That simply can't happen. That's not a solution to the humanitarian crisis. Hamas not only enacts attrition and terror on the Israelis, but also on their own people. They have stolen humanitarian aid to then sell to the Palestinians of Gaza. They've provided, since 2005, no civil infrastructure, no political infrastructure. They've just created a complex network of terror infrastructure. The tunnels in Gaza are larger than the New York subway system. So any money, any efforts have been put forth towards achieving their terror aims and not for providing for the Palestinians of Gaza so that they actually have a chance of self-determination. I want to remind everyone that when Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, that was the experiment for Palestinian self-determination. That was the hope. And Israel gave them the Gaza Strip. They removed, which we're talking about ethnic cleansing, Israel removed 9,000 Israeli Jews who were living in different kibbutz or different communities within the Gaza Strip and IDF outpost. They moved them to sovereign or with inside sovereign Israeli borders, which then were redrawn to exclude the Gaza Strip. And the hope was that the Palestinians would take that opportunity in good faith to move towards the two-state solution. And we see now that that was a grave mistake from a security perspective for Israel. It was a failed experiment in diplomacy. And since 2005, when Gaza had its one and only election, when Hamas was elected by the Palestinians of Gaza, there have not been free and fair elections held since. And Hamas's interest as a terror organization is their own survival. They are not interested in providing the infrastructure needed for Palestinian Gazans to thrive. They are interested in maintaining their political power, and their aims are zero sum. They're not interested in diplomacy. I don't understand why that's so hard for people in the West to understand. They're not interested in talks, in diplomacy. They use the international community, the Red Cross, they use it to their own strategic advantage. They are not interested in Western norms, ideas, democracy, human rights. They're not interested. The jihadist worldview mindset is zero sum. They are interested in a holy war to take back what they view the land of modern Israel as part of a larger Muslim caliphate, as it was under the Ottoman Empire. Anyways, I digress. So, another part of the ceasefire agreement is not just the return of hostages in exchange for prisoners, but also that the Palestinians who were living in central and southern Gaza since the war started, those who were displaced from up north are now being allowed to return home. So I'm going to play a clip showing some of the videos of the thousands of Gazans going back to their homes in the north.
Are returning home to the north of Gaza for the first time since they were forced to flee their homes at the start of Israel's war on Gaza over a year ago. A river of people that stretched for miles walked north along Gaza's coastal road Monday, carrying what's left of their possessions. Most Palestinians will be returning to find their homes reduced to rubble. The UN estimates 92% of homes in Gaza have been destroyed or damaged over the last 16 months.
So, you see these very moving images of people almost like running back to their homes, many of whom are going to arrive to rubble, to nothing. So Israel moved those living in the north at the beginning of the war after October 7th so that they could enact their ground offensive in Gaza and reduce the civilian casualties at the start of the offensive. However, Hamas drew them to the interior of Gaza, again, hiding in humanitarian zones or in densely populated urban areas. And that drew the conflict to the interior. And we've seen unfortunate civilian casualties. And what President Trump is proposing is, all right, let's remove the calculus of civilians so that Israel can complete their war and eliminate Hamas. And so I have that clip of him here speaking to the reporter.
So I'm looking at the whole Gaza Strip right now, and it's a mess. It's a real mess. I'd like Jordan to house people from Gaza, to take people. I'd like Egypt to take people. I'm meeting with, I'm talking to General El-Sisi tomorrow, sometime, I believe. And I'd like Egypt to take people, and I'd like Jordan to take people. I mean, you're talking about probably 1.5 million people, and we just clean out that whole thing. I said, it's over the centuries, that's many, many conflicts that site. And I don't know, something has to happen, but it's literally a demolition site right now. Almost everything's demolished.
All right, so President Trump said a few things. He said it's a mess. So I think he's identifying the fact that reconstruction at this point is almost impossible when you consider the fact that Hamas is still maintaining a large amount of control on territory in Gaza. He mentions that the place needs to be cleaned out. I'm about to show you a clip of the last reporter I just showed you talking about the accusations of ethnic cleansing. I think that soundbite is really what kind of ushered or fueled those accusations. We're going to look at what ethnic cleansing is in a moment as well. But when he says clean the place out, he's talking about from Hamas, from the terror infrastructure. And he also mentions, conflict in this part of the world has been going on for centuries. Something is not working, is the point he's making. The status quo is not tenable. Really, the two-state solution, I think, is a scapegoat for the international community and academics, politicians, to face the harsh reality of this conflict. I do think the two-state solution at some point in the future could be possible, but jumping from the destruction of this war and the hold Hamas still has in Gaza to a two-state solution is an impossible chasm or an impossible gap to close. That is such wishful thinking, and we need a next step before we can even entertain what that looks like. As I mentioned, Israel's unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip was that experiment. That experiment failed. There has since been countless years of attrition, of terror. We also now have the war after October 7th, a horrific day. And we have Hamas's stated objective to continue inflicting more October 7th. So peace is not possible. Diplomacy is not possible. The jihad mindset, the zero-sum aims of Hamas, does not want peace. Their only solution is a single state, Palestinian state, ridding from the river to the sea every Jew. And so when you have an actor that is so set in both terror as a legitimate means of resistance and also is not interested in diplomacy, but just uses the international community's diplomatic efforts to their own strategic aims, you're never going to have a two-state solution, ever. As I noted, Hamas has provided no political, no civil infrastructure for their people. There is no economy. There is no industry for the people in Gaza to work. That's why terrorism is so popular and attractive to the young people in Gaza. They rely on Israel for water, for electricity, for jobs. That's not what a sovereign nation does. That's not what a legitimate state does. The Gaza Strip is a weak and failed state. It's a weak and failed experiment. And so we need a next step forward. Here is that video of that anchor accusing Trump of ethnic cleansing.
President Trump's facing accusations of supporting ethnic cleansing in Gaza after saying he wants to, quote, clean out the whole thing. Trump called for Egypt and Jordan to take in Palestinians living in Gaza while speaking to reporters aboard Air Force One Saturday. He told the reporters he'd spoken to King Abdullah of Jordan.
All right, so again, clean out the whole thing, not of Palestinians. The intent is not to rid that geographic area of Palestinians, is to rid it of Hamas and their complex network of terror infrastructure so that they cannot continue their attrition on Israel and on their own people. The way she's framing it, though, is that he's saying this about ethnically cleansing Palestinians of the area. And she also mentions that he talked to Egypt and Jordan. Egypt and Jordan have since said they reject the proposal. It undermines the two-state solution. They're not interested. An important thing to note is Egypt also has a border with the Gaza Strip. Everyone always accuses Israel of keeping Palestinian Gazans in an open-air prison, but the fourth wall of that prison is Egypt. They're not interested. They don't want the political poison that is the Hamas ideology and Hamas mindset, which has completely ideologically possessed the youth in Gaza, which makes up a large percentage of the population. Egypt has governed the Gaza Strip at different periods throughout history, most recently from 1957 to 1967. They don't want the Gaza Strip. They don't want the Palestinians in Gaza. They've made that quite clear. I think it's a threat to their own political stability. Egypt obviously having had the Muslim Brotherhood, and I don't think Jordan wants that political unrest or that ideology infiltrating their sovereign borders and their domestic politics, which is, I think, the real reason why they're not interested in bringing in Palestinians from Gaza. And they've taken a very hands-off approach since the start of this war and since long before. Their line is two-state solution. They oftentimes condemn Israel, but the entire Arab world's official policy position has been a two-state solution with very little efforts to see that realized, which is, I think, very important to note that Trump's also calling on them to do something. So even if it's not bringing in Palestinians from Gaza, I think Trump's call is on Egypt and Jordan to step up. It's not just Israel's responsibility. It's not just America's responsibility. They're Arab neighbors who share a religion, a tongue. In Jordan, many Palestinian Arabs live within sovereign Jordan. They should step up. This is their people. This is their kin. They should play a role. And so it'll be interesting over the course of President Trump's second term to see if he's able to spearhead that initiative. So we've seen, of course, the media run with the ethnic cleansing narrative. This is Al Jazeera saying Trump suggests he wants ethnic cleansing in the Gaza Strip. Is it feasible? I think the question, is it feasible, is a different question. Is it feasible to take 1.5 million civilians, even if the aim is to minimize civilian casualties? Is it possible to take those individuals and transport them somewhere else? I think from a security kind of perspective, the fine line between civilian and combatant makes that very, very difficult. And I think a lot of the Arab world wants to contain the Hamas ideology geographically within Gaza. They're not interested in taking that on and taking it in, as I mentioned before. So I think logistically, that's a different question. The question of ethnic cleansing, though, is what's going to occupy the political and cultural debate. So, unlike genocide, which is codified in international law from the Genocide Convention at the UN and passed in the General Assembly, the term ethnic cleansing is not legally recognized in international law as having one official definition that is then the standard for international law. It is a norm, though. It's a term that has kind of become commonplace when talking about conflict. We've seen ethnic cleansing used in different UN Security Councils. And we do have historic precedent of what ethnic cleansing is. So the term really surfaced in the context of the 1990s in the breakdown of former Yugoslavia. And we did see different examples of ethnic cleansing. For those who are unaware, Yugoslavia, which was once part of the Soviet Union, had a similar battle between these different ethno-religious groups for the right to self-determine and to be their own nationalist identities. So the former Yugoslavia was essentially a confederation. And in 1991, I believe Slovenia was the first to secede from that confederation. And then it ushered in all of the different states within the confederation demanding their own states. The problem being they also wanted their own homogenous sovereign nations. But there was a lot of intermixing. So you have the Serbs who are Orthodox. So we also see ethnic and religious identity being important, which also heightens any conflict. The Croats were Catholic. The Slovenians were also Catholic. The Bosniaks were a Slavic people, but were Muslim and they speak Bosnian. The Macedonians were Orthodox, as well as the Montenegrins, and the Albanians are Muslim. And so we see the fight for ridding different territory of these ethnic identities. So here's this map from 1990, and then we have one contrasting it in 2015. The two areas I'll point to as being the most significant when we talk about examples of ethnic cleansing is going to be in Croatia. You can see the purple and the blue in 1990, and then you just see an entirely purple country in 2015. And so what Croatia did was they pushed a lot of the Serbs out. They were trying to create an ethnically homogenous, meaning entirely Croat, contiguous area of territory. Contiguous meaning like one continual area. If you look at the map of Israel, you have Gaza and the West Bank. So the Palestinian territories are not contiguous. They're not geographically connected. And then if you look even within the West Bank or Judea Samaria, you have areas A, B, and C, which are then further divided up between Israel and Palestine. And it looks a little bit like Swiss cheese. And so unlike in the conflict with Israel and the Palestinians, in the former Yugoslavia, they were trying to achieve land that was contiguous. And so you see in 2015 here as well, the green, which are the Bosniak Muslims, they have been forced into a homogenous and contiguous area of land. And so it was in Croatia and then in Bosnia with the Bosniaks that we saw ethnic cleansing take place. And that is really our example of ethnic cleansing from a historic and a political standpoint, similar to the definition of genocide, which is the intent to destroy in part or in whole. The intent of ethnic cleansing is to remove for territorial aims. And so you see displaced people, people who maybe have lived in that area for thousands of generations, thousands of years, hundreds of generations, being displaced, which is extremely emotional and it's unfortunate. It can also be bloody and contentious, which we also saw in the breakdown of former Yugoslavia. But it is a reality of conflict and war, which is something I really want to drive home, which is displaced people, civilian casualties are so unfortunate. but sometimes that is just the reality of war and conflict, and it has been throughout human history. Now, that doesn't mean we don't try and seek a political outcome with our modern international norms and the use of diplomacy, but it has been seen in past conflicts before. And as I mentioned, Israel withdrew 9,000 of their Jewish Israeli residents from the Gaza Strip. So we have seen displacement in the conflict we are talking about as well. But I think the intent is really important. I don't think President Trump is trying to remove Palestinians from Gaza for the sake of removing them from Gaza so that the Israeli Jews can come in and live there in a homogenous territorial zone. I believe President Trump's aims are to take away the possibility for civilian casualties, to make this war less bloody than it has been, to remove the calculus of civilians so that Israel can complete its war. And that is the intent that I think we need to look at. And also just to remember that ethnic cleansing, we have historic examples, but there is no international definition. But we will see the pro-Palestinian narrative peddle that, similar to how they have with genocide. I mean, we have a codified definition of genocide, and that largely has not mattered because the international community has still condemned Israel of genocide, even though there is not a single example of this conflict that you can point to that fits that definition. And then I also want to suggest that President Trump's proposal for especially Jordan to play a larger role is actually a very logical one. There are many Arab Palestinians living within Jordan, and that's because the mandate for Palestine, which is initially this entire area, the map I have on the screen, was supposed to be the Jewish state. And then Transjordan emerged. The Hashemite kingdom was promised their own nation state. But Palestinian Arabs used to live in this entire area. Now, I know there might be people in the comment section saying there's no such thing as ethnically Palestinian Arabs or just all Arab. Regardless of that historic debate, the idea of Palestinians as an ethnicity today is a thing. And we can't talk about a solution without acknowledging that even if it is a socially constructed identity, which I'm not making a judgment on in this podcast, it is an identity nonetheless. And so there are many people who might identify as Palestinian Arabs who live in Jordan today. And so I think it makes them a very natural partner in either providing refuge for Palestinians in Gaza or for being an important actor in brokering the next steps for self-determination for the Palestinian people, which is exactly what this article proposes, which is what I want to end with. Elliot Abrams writes this in CFR, Palestine and Jordan. Elliot has written an article entitled The Two-State Delusion, which I will link below, which is, again, an unpopular thing to say, but it's also very observable. It has not come to fruition since 1948, when Israel was recognized as a sovereign nation. This has been a conflict that has occupied the geopolitical space for 80 years. But I want to get to this part. He says, I've suggested instead that the Palestinian entity be part of a confederation. Its neighbors are Jordan and Israel. And up until this point, the status quo has always charged Israel with coming up with that solution. And of those, the Muslim, Arab, Arabic speaking, and half Palestinian Hashemite kingdom. So again, noting that because of how the modern nation state of Jordan was drafted, many Palestinian Arabs fell within Transjordan, modern day Jordan today. The half Palestinian Hashemite kingdom of Jordan is the logical candidate. One can envision the Palestinian entity as a kind of Kurdistan. So essentially, or also mentions that the Hashemite kingdom be a kind of Austria-Hungary. So they have one king, one army, but they also have two prime ministers and two parliaments. And then the Palestinian state under the umbrella of Jordan could self-determine. And the legitimate governance that Jordan has would lend legitimacy to the Palestinian cause for self-determination, right? So we mentioned, the PA in the West Bank, Hamas in Gaza. It's largely been a failed experiment for self-determination. There's examples of it being a failed state. In Gaza, I would say it's a weak state. In the West Bank, the PA is very unpopular. The infrastructure, political, civil, economic of Jordan could provide a blueprint or an umbrella for the Palestinians to self-determine. because at the moment they don't have any of that, which are necessary preconditions for, statehood and self-determination. And so this could be a viable solution. This is, of course, just one solution. I'm throwing it out there as an interesting thought experiment. I don't pretend to have the answer to this conflict, but it does raise a really important question, which is, what are the next steps? What does that look like? If Hamas cannot have the keys to Gaza after this war, if not for the sake of Israel, for the sake of their own people, then what are some of the next steps and who are some of those actors that could play a role? It'll be interesting to see if President Trump can persuade or incentivize Jordan, which is, I think, the country I'm most interested in, but also Egypt, in playing a larger role. He called on both nations in his last term to play a larger role, which there was never anything that materialized from that diplomatically. But I believe the region looks different now. I think the region realizes that there needs to be some sort of a solution. And so moving forward, this will be a very interesting piece of the conflict to follow. So again, to reiterate, President Trump's suggestion is we try something different because the status quo has not worked. He is not proposing an ethnic cleansing, pointing out that there is no international definition of ethnic cleansing. But even if we look at comparative historic examples, the intent that President Trump is, or his solution, the intent behind it is not to rid the area geographically of Palestinians so that it can be a homogenous Jewish piece of territory. His aim is to rid it of Hamas so that there can be hope for some sort of tenable solution for Palestinian self-determination. And this raises some serious and maybe even unpopular questions on what that might be. But surely it can't be what we have been doing all along. Something has to change. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I will link Elliot's article in the description box down below if you would like to read it. As I said, it's a very interesting thought experiment and an alternative to the status quo, which I think is important, especially after this war, to try and find a real and tangible solution. I'll see you in the next episode. Have a good day.